Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. Today I want to talk a little bit about why, in spite of the fondest hopes and dreams of Trekkies like my good friend Luke Ranieri, the notion of a universal translator just doesn't work, or it certainly doesn't with the state of computing today. I've talked about sort of similar subjects, particularly I have a video about why Google Translate Icelandic doesn't work. This is in spite of the fact that I'm pretty sure Disney used Google Translate Icelandic for the song and the coronation scene in Frozen, which you can barely hear, thankfully. Icelandic just has a grammar that's too different from English, and it's idiomatically too different from English. Same way I made a video a couple years ago called something like Old Norse Translation, Why You Need an Expert, explaining why people so often, when they just use an Old Norse dictionary to translate from English to Old Norse, make mistakes that no speaker or experienced reader, to use living people as examples today, would make such mistakes. The premise of a universal translator, though, which of course exists in Star Trek, I was thinking about this because of that episode where the, what are they called? Did I write this down? Tamarians, in that one episode of Star Trek, The Next Generation. They can't be understood by the universal translator, not because of some grammatical linguistic feature, but because they speak in metaphors and allusions that aren't necessarily clear to speakers of other languages. Or, well, you have to know the metaphor, the allusion. It's not a linguistic barrier, it's a cultural barrier. But to some extent, all languages have those built in, and they can seem really minor, but if you have an intelligence that's not human trying to do the translation process, you can get really weird results. So for example, in English, if I say, I can't make a buck, you know that what I mean as a competent English speaker is I can't make money, right? By the way, it is not in all languages that you quote unquote make money. That in itself is an interesting idiomatic difference. But if we look at how that would be expressed in modern Icelandic, of course, I'm not a native speaker of Icelandic, maybe I'll make mistakes here, but I don't think so. I would say, ég get ekki grætt peninga. So from an English language grammar and cognate perspective, I get not monies, what would I say for græða? I mean, earned. I get no monies earned, right? Now, that makes fairly intuitive sense, but it is not necessarily a direct translation of the expression, I can't make a buck, right? You can imagine a Google Translate or Universal Translator-like service translating that into literally, I am not able to create a stag, right? And in fact, that is what Google Translate is quite capable of doing if you input that today in 2023. But there's even more of these expressions just built in at the most basic level of communication. In English, if I say hold it to someone, I might be saying, literally hold on to something that's in your grip, or I might be saying stop, but that's not necessarily obvious even from the perspective of a closely cognate language if you haven't encountered, haven't had a lot of exposure to English. If you use a navigation app, Google Maps or Waze or something like that, in a Scandinavian language such as Norwegian or Swedish, when it tells you to hold, for example, hold till venstre, right, hold to the left, it's telling you to continue that, right, not to stop to the left. These are things that I think it would take a pretty long time to teach any sort of artificial intelligence. It's not necessarily that this is impossible, but I feel like such an intelligence would have to have truly generative abilities of its own to comprehend how to translate not just words and phrases, but intents, right? I mean, from a human perspective, it almost has to be sort of psychic, right? I mean, that's really what a universal translator is, especially for a language that's never been encountered before, as you often see in the Star Trek series. I'm going to come back with a couple more examples drawing on some Old Norse stuff right after a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost. I was thinking about this as I've been working on my Old Norse textbook, which is my next book scheduled with Hackett Publishing Company. There are some interesting cases in Old Norse where you actually do have closely cognate vocabulary, but you don't necessarily have closely cognate ideas. For example, in the story that Snorri tells in the Prose Edda about the builder who makes the wall around Oasgarðr, the realm of the gods, he has to make it o einum vetri, literally on one winter. Now that may sound, you know, obvious or transparent to an English speaker. Well, you know, December to February, or maybe colloquially something like November to February. But in an Old Norse context, that really means something like what we would consider late October to late April. The year is split into 2 seasons, 2 miseri, not into 4 in the oldest version of the Old Norse calendar. So you end up having to substitute a pretty different concept, you have to say, in 1 half year, right? Which is not exactly the same. It's not as economical of an expression. Think about just saying, I don't know. In English, this is said in a really, all of our negatives are actually pretty different from other Indo-European languages, right? We have this dummy verb, don't, or past tense, didn't, or doesn't in the present third tense singular, instead of just saying, I know not, which is the typical way of saying this in other languages. Now, in Old Norse, you would have a typical way of saying this, ek veit eigi. That would be a prose way of saying it. Although, in poetry, you can even have something like veitak, where veit is what means know, a is a suffix, it means the negative, does not know, and the K is a suffixed word, ek, I. Or consider Spanish, where typically you would just say no sé. You wouldn't typically have to say the yo, the I there. All of these mean the same thing, but is a universal translator going to be ready for the differences in, if we're going to talk about alien languages or otherwise unfamiliar languages, not necessarily expressing part of that, right? I mean, in Spanish, the I is coded into the form of the verb. Is a universal translator going to be ready for that if it hasn't ever experienced this language before? I just don't know how that works. Consider the same thing with how English forms questions, right? In English, I have to say, what does a raven want? Not what wants a raven, unless I'm writing really pretentious old-fashioned poetry. But that's how I would have to translate this into Old Norse or Spanish, right? What vill hrafnin? Or, you know, que quiere el cuervo? Right, there's no equivalent to that dummy verb does. Or think of an expression in Old Norse like Þótt volsunga ætt sé at þér. So, though the family of Volsungs is at you. This is a concessive subjunctive. The verb se means is, but with a some sense that's not exactly indicative, doesn't exactly express truth. It concedes a truth, it implies a truth, it questions a truth, or it's something somebody else said. Here it's concessive, right? I admit, in a sense, that you are of the Volsungs family, but we wouldn't say that way in English, right? Though that family is at you. I don't think I know how to teach a a machine how to do that. Even the vaunted isomorph that was being worked at by Tim Tangolini and others at UCLA some 10 years ago. Or a similar deal, what þér at ógleði? What is to you at ungladness, right? So bizarrely idiomatic from an English expression, but to a competent reader, what's making you unhappy? What is to you at unhappiness? Actually, Celtic languages have even more expressions of that kind that I think will really challenge machine translation, probably already do. So I just feel like this notion that there could be a universal translator, at least with the way any sort of artificial intelligence works today, it's a little bit like the concept that aliens will be like us, but just with different foreheads, right? If we don't know how other languages work that are really even pretty closely related, but pretty different structurally from ours, like Icelandic, we're going to wind up producing something that is just English with a thin veneer of that other language. Or possibly worse, when we translate that other language, we're going to have, it's really going to be, you know, it's going to be so idiomatically off for the target language that we're not going to understand what we're translating. You know, a little bit maybe like the idea that all planets are SoCal, right? Like you often see in Star Trek series. So I don't know that in looking at something like the Temerians of Star Trek, that's anything more than an absurdity. I mean, in order to tell stories like their language consists of, you have to have words that mean something other than stories. So, you know, I question that premise. But it did get me thinking about the way that really all languages have not just cultural, but idiomatic things built into them that make the notion of a universal translator, at least as I'm speaking in 2023, pretty infeasible. So, with that said, thank you, Patreon, for your continued support for this channel. Thank you to those of you who buy my books, including forthcoming at some point, this book that hopefully will teach you to read Old Norse if for some reason that's something you want to do. And beautiful Colorado, let me wish you all the best.